Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on the Conservation Zones Review with a focus on Pittwater for tonight. I might just give everyone a few more seconds to come into the meeting and then we'll kick things off. All right, we might make a start. Welcome everybody. My name's Andrew Piggott. I'm the Executive Manager of Strategic and Place Planning at Northern Beaches Council. We are welcoming you tonight to our Conservation Zones Review information webinar with a focus on the Pittwater area. We've been undertaking a review of the conservation zones, which we previously called environmental protection zones, for the preparation of a new local environmental plan for the Northern Beaches Council. And the purpose of today is to provide you with as much information as we can in relation to the conservation zones review and to outline how we've proposed to apply those across the Northern Beaches consistently. Today's session is focused on the Pittwater area, and if you are interested in other areas, then you can book into the presentations as we go through those for the rest of this week and into next week. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country and say that we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we are meeting and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and all Aboriginal people here with us tonight. In relation to the agenda for tonight, we will take you through some background information, an overview of the conservation zones, outline how we intend to apply the draft conservation zones with a focus on the Pittwater area. We'll take you through an overview of some of the technical studies that have informed the decision making in relation to the zones and outline the next steps. So the purpose of tonight is to provide a high-level overview. We won't necessarily drill right down into specific properties, and we'll finish with a Q&A with an opportunity for us to answer questions as they arrive. Just a bit of housekeeping and some conventions. We will look to provide as much information as we can. Again, we'll look at the bigger picture, Northern Beaches, with a focus on Pittwater without drilling right down to site-specific details. If you do have site-specific questions, by all means, we're happy to answer those if you contact us via email or on the phone in the days following tonight's briefing. We'll be happy to talk to you and respond to your questions. In the interest of progressing through the meeting and being able to communicate as much information as we can to you, the microphones and cameras will be turned off for the meeting. Questions and comments can be made via the Q&A button, which hopefully you'll be able to see in the top right-hand corner of your screen. You can type in a question and we will attempt to answer that. If we can't answer it tonight, we'll take it on notice and come back to you with an answer following the meeting. Just to confirm that this webinar will be recorded. So that's just something that we wanted to let you know. And we'll also respond to your questions as best we can. Okay, just a bit of background on the project itself. Our Planning Our Sustainable Future program that we've been working on for several months now, trying to prepare one new Northern Beaches local environmental plan and development control plan. So we started out with a LEP review and health check back in November 2018. We then prepared our local strategic planning statement, which was adopted in March of 2020. We then prepared a local housing strategy, which was adopted in March 2021. We put out a LEP DCP discussion paper around the middle of last year. And all of that information has fed into the work we're doing now in terms of the preparation of our conservation zones review and the technical studies that have informed that review. So we're on exhibition at the moment. The exhibition formally closes on the 30th of October. I'm happy to take any and all submissions and questions people have throughout that process. We'll then review all of the submissions and that will inform the decisions that we make in relation to our draft local environmental plan and development control plan for the Northern Beaches that we will take through another round of exhibition next year. Meridian Urban are consultants that have assisted us through this program, and Kim Kirsten is a consultant that has been working very closely with us. Kim will take us through the background information and approach used to create the draft conservation zones. So I'll just get ready to hand over to Kim, who will step us through that process and where things are up to. Thanks, Kim. Having a bit of trouble hearing you, Kim. We can see you.
I'm here.
There you go.
Thank you, Andrew, and good evening, everybody. Before I jump into the approach we undertook in the creation of the draft conservation zones, to start with, we just need to explain what some of the key terms are to give context to the conservation zones review. As Andrew mentioned earlier, Council is in the process of preparing a single planning framework, which involves preparing a new local environmental plan. A local environmental plan, or an LEP, is a legal instrument that establishes land use zones and standards to control development. Across the Northern Beaches, there are 4 existing LEPs, including the Pittwater LEP, Warringah LEP, Warringah LEP 2000 for deferred matters land, and the Manly LEP. As part of preparing a single planning framework, a new LEP will be prepared for the entire Northern Beaches. LEPs are prepared by the relevant council and approved by the state government. What are zones? Zones and development controls provide a framework for the way the land can be used. This framework for the zones is standardised and set by the state government. Zones set out what land uses are allowed or permitted, and what land uses are prohibited. These land uses must relate to the objectives of those zones. There are different zones that can be used depending on the intent of that land, and these can include rural zones, residential zones, commercial zones, industrial zones, recreation zones, waterway zones, and conservation zones. Today, we are discussing the conservation zones. What are conservation zones? Conservation zones, or C zones, are used to protect and manage land that is of important environmental value. There are 4 conservation zones, or C zones, identified for land where the primary focus is the conservation and or management of environmental values or natural processes on that land. The C zones provide for the varying levels of environmental protection and management. The C1 zone, this top zone, comprises existing national parks, nature reserves and conservation areas established under the National Parks and Wildlife Act. As such, the C1 zone was not included as part of the conservation zones review. The C2 zone provides that next highest level of protection and is for protecting, conserving and rehabilitating land with very high ecological values. So this can include land with wetlands and littoral rainforests and areas of high value remnant vegetation, generally on public land, and land that has an environmental protection mechanism on it to protect those conservation values, such as a biobanking agreement or a stewardship agreement. The C3 zone is also for protecting and conserving and rehabilitating land with high ecological values, or land that has environmental processes or hazards that requires careful management. The C3 zone allows development in limited circumstances, such as low impact development that is compatible with protecting those ecological values, or is compatible with the risks associated with land affected by natural hazards. The C4 zone is also for protecting and conserving environmental values. However, it accommodates low impact residential development. So it is generally used in low density residential areas to protect land with special ecological values and still allow residential uses to occur on that land, such as dwelling houses. Why are the C zones being reviewed? Across Pittwater, Warringah and Manly, there is a variation in how the C zones have been applied in terms of their environmental criteria, their spatial application and the range of land uses permitted. The map on the right shows the differences across the northern beaches. So for example, much of Pittwater is a C4 zone, which is the area shaded in light brown. There is limited C zones in Warringah across this area. And in Manly, C zones are generally found along the foreshore area. So the C zones review will ensure a greater protection of the environment, a consistent approach, align with any updated studies and deliver on Council's commitments. What is the purpose of the C zones review? The purpose of the review was to undertake a review and develop a consistent approach for identifying land across the northern beaches with important environmental values and land subject to hazards that should be protected and managed by a C zone. As previously said, the C1 zone comprises existing national parks, nature reserves and conservation areas established under the National Parks and Wildlife Act. And as such, it was not included as part of the Conservation Zones review. The approach for undertaking the C Zones review required a robust, research-driven process and a focus on focus group engagement to understand local issues and experiences and identify the important environmental values and hazards across the northern beaches that need to be protected and managed. In terms of developing the C zones that are currently on exhibition, Phase 1 involved a review of any existing information. This included state expectations and policy requirements, other C zone reviews undertaken by other councils, including the Northern Council's E zone review, which was undertaken by the state government, technical information, including supporting technical studies and mapping prepared by council, which is also out on exhibition currently. Community feedback, which included a series of 5 community focus group sessions, which were undertaken in September and October in 2020. And the purpose of those was to identify what environmental values are important for the community across the different places in the northern beaches. Phase 2 then involved identifying the environmental criteria that need protection and the natural hazard processes that need careful management, such as bushfire and flooding, as well as the required data to spatially identify the land affected by that criteria. Phases 3 and 4 involve creating and preparing the proposed draft C zones, which are currently on public exhibition, together with the supporting technical review report. We are currently in Phase 5 and publicly exhibiting the draft C zones review report and associated mapping outputs. Council is seeking feedback on the criteria and methodology used to create the draft C zones. Following public exhibition, submissions will be reviewed and considered. Any site visits will be undertaken as needed and recommendations for council finalised as part of phases 6 and 7. This slide provides a high-level overview of what was said through the previous 5 focus group sessions with a focus on Pittwater. Feedback received noted that consultation with the community is required. There was support for protecting the environment, including prioritising and protecting wildlife corridors. Corridors, tree cover, waterways, bushfire were considered important environmental values in Pittwater. There was support for maintaining the existing C4 zoning in Pittwater and protecting the existing C2 zoned land. Comments suggested applying a transition area or a buffer to further protect high-value biodiversity areas. C zones were also considered important for water quality. Comments received also noted that C zones are critical to the coastal communities, noting that coastal areas are subject to coastal subsidence and flooding. And development should not add to the coastal risk coastal risk that is already there. Areas with high bushfire risk should also be a C zone. The next part of the briefing, we will go through the draft methodology used for creating the draft C zones. We are seeking comments and submissions on the proposed methodology, which has been used to create the C zones. This includes these next couple of slides, which shows the criteria used to inform the spatial mapping. The Conservation Zones Review has identified a number of environmental values that are worthy of protection through a potential C zone. These criteria have been broken into two values, including high environmental value criteria and medium environmental value criteria. The high environmental value criteria identifies land with high ecological values or the greatest biodiversity and number of species that should be conserved and protected. This includes land with bushland reserves and parks, existing C2 zoned land, biodiversity core habitat areas, which is generally large expanses of relatively intact native vegetation or land with a very high conservation significance, threatened ecological communities and threatened species habitat, wetlands and riparian corridors, selected land in heritage conservation areas with high environmental value, and transitional areas between high conservation value land and low density residential land in urban areas. Medium value criteria were also identified and are an important consideration for identifying land with important environmental values. However, that land may have been disturbed or modified, or the land requires careful management. For example, biodiversity corridors and the urban tree canopy facilitates flora and fauna movement across the landscape and are an important consideration for connecting bushland with urban settings. Escarpments, major ridgelines and sloping land, which given their limitations for development over time, has meant that generally they are forested and therefore contribute to that urban ecology in suburban residential settings. Planning for natural hazards is fundamentally about the risks to life and property, but it's also about taking steps to limit future impositions on other government functions like disaster management and the expenditure on recovery and reconstruction. Therefore, it is proposed that the C3 zone considers land affected by high-risk natural hazards as well, where the further intensification of these areas would expose people and property to an unacceptable or intolerable level of risk, and buildings would be vulnerable to failure. It is important to note that utilising a C3 zone on land affected by high-risk natural hazards is also about identifying what land uses are compatible given the nature of the risk on that land in terms of its tolerance. Land uses such as community infrastructure and critical services, vulnerable uses, and residential land and residential and accommodation activities are generally considered intolerable in locations where there is a high hazard risk. As part of the C zones, the hazard criteria constraints identified include land subject to coastal and estuarine hazards, land affected by high risk flooding, land affected by high risk bushfire, and land affected by steeply sloping coastal cliffs which are susceptible to instability. The next few slides, we will discuss how the environmental and hazard criteria will apply for the C2, C3 and C4 zones with a focus on Pittwater. The C2 zone is proposed to include natural open space and bushland areas which are primarily managed for conservation purposes outside of national parks and nature reserves. The C2 zone is also proposed for land with an existing C2 zone, which is zoned for environmental protection, and where strict controls on development already apply, as well as land that has an existing conservation mechanism requiring its protection for its conservation values, such as a biobanking agreement or a conservation covenant. The map on the right shows that most of the C2 zone across Pittwater includes land that is currently included in an existing C2 zone. This includes the existing C2 zone that extends along waterways along the western foreshore areas, so along through here, as well as across the Pittwater Peninsula and around Narrabeen Lagoon, around here and here. The C3 zone is proposed to be considered across both urban and non-urban settings. The map on the right shows the urban areas in pink and the non-urban areas in a light browny colour. This slide is about the application of the C3 zone in non-urban areas. So non-urban areas have extensive tracts of high-value bushland coupled with larger minimum lot sizes, which prevents further lot fragmentation. In non-urban areas, the C3 zone is proposed to apply to land that is identified as having undeveloped bushland, and the site is mapped with one or more of the high environmental criteria. For properties less than 5,000 square metres, a C3 zone will be applied where 50% or more of the site is affected. No split zones will apply. Split zones, however, are proposed to be considered on properties that are larger, so for properties 5,000 square metres or more, where 30 to 70% of that property is affected. If 70% or more of the property is affected, the entire site is proposed to be included within a C3 zone. The C3 zone is also proposed to be considered on land where there is a presence of high natural hazard risks, such as bushfire. The map on the right shows that most of the land proposed to be included in a C3 zone in the non-urban areas of Pittwater include the Western Foreshore coastal communities, which are currently included in an existing C3 zone, as well as the Ingleside area, which includes properties that are predominantly covered in bushland, and as a result, the property is identified as having core habitat, as well as being affected by high bushfire hazard. In urban areas, the C3 zone is proposed to be used on land affected by high-risk natural hazards, such as flooding and coastal hazard risks. They are proposed as a way to manage development and limit incompatible land uses which are sensitive to natural hazard risks or difficult to evacuate. As previously discussed, the natural hazard criteria considered includes mapped coastal and estuarine hazards, land affected by high-risk flooding, land affected by high-risk bushfire, and land in close proximity to coastal cliff zones which are susceptible to instability. The map on the right shows that most of the land proposed to be included in a C3 zone in the urban areas of Pittwater generally includes properties along the coastline, through here and through here. Properties included for a proposed C3 zone are largely as a result of the property being affected by coastal and estuarine hazards in this location, and or coastal cliff hazards, which is generally on this side. With the presence of high environmental values, biodiversity corridors, leafy escarpment lands, major ridge lines and steep slopes, the Northern Beaches has one of the highest urban tree canopy coverages in Greater Sydney. The C4 environmental living zone is proposed for the suburban low density residential areas that contain high environmental criteria and or 2 or more medium biodiversity criteria, which will recognise and protect the urban ecology of the Northern Beaches low density residential areas. Properties with 50% or more of the site affected by a high environmental value or 2 or more medium environmental values were identified as potential sites for a C4 zone. The map on the right shows that most of the land proposed to be included in a C4 zone in Pittwater properties proposed for a C4 zone are largely as a result of the property being identified with threatened ecological communities. So there's a bit of threatened ecological communities through here and through here. The property being identified as a transition property as it is adjacent to high conservation value land. The property being identified as being included in a selected conservation area with high environmental values, such as along Ruskin Row. Or the property being identified with 2 or more medium environmental values as the property has a combination of biodiversity corridor, urban tree canopy cover, ridge lines and escarpments, or steep slopes. This slide shows the proposed permitted land uses across the C2, C3 and C4 zones. Dwelling houses are not permitted on land zone C2 under the existing local environmental plans. However, they are permitted on land zone C3. This is not proposed to be changed and will be carried over. The C3 zone is proposed to not permit land uses that may not be compatible with natural hazards, including childcare facilities, community facilities, education establishments, respite daycare centres, group homes and secondary dwellings. The C4 and the residential R2 zone are similar in that they both allow dwelling houses, group homes, secondary dwellings, as well as low intensity community activities such as home businesses and childcare facilities and community facilities. The main difference between the C4 zone and the residential R2 zone is that the recognition of environmental attributes requiring the careful consideration during assessment of a development application. And complying development is permitted in the R2 zone, but will not be permitted in the C4 zone. That means that a development application would be required. I'll now briefly touch on the technical studies which have informed the C zones review and also out on public exhibition. Council is also seeking feedback and comments on the draft technical studies during this exhibition period. Please note that we will briefly talk through the studies relevant to Pittwater. If you are interested in any of the other studies which are on exhibition, they are available on Council's website. The Draft Biodiversity Planning Review is a Northern Beaches-wide technical study which has been prepared to better inform future biodiversity planning controls. The study has included a review of previous biodiversity-related technical studies and mapping related to the 3 former local government areas, including Pittwater. Draft mapping has been used to inform the C zones mapping analysis and includes key wildlife habitats or core habitats, which are typically those larger areas of bushland as identified in green on the map, as well as biodiversity or wildlife corridors, which are identified in blue. Threatened ecological communities, such as the Pittwater spotted gum forest, and threatened species habitats or areas such as the grey-headed flying fox colonies at Warriewood and Avalon. The Watercourse, Wetlands and Riparian Land Study summarises a series of technical studies undertaken by environmental consulting firm BMT. It sought to review existing planning controls across the 3 former local government areas associated with watercourse and riparian matters, and it provided recommendations and updated mapping to be incorporated in a unified Northern Beaches local environmental plan and development control plan. Recommendations and mapping identified Category 1 and Category 2 riparian corridors, including a 30-metre buffer zone, and identified wetland areas, including a 100-metre buffer zone. Riparian corridors and wetlands are an important high-value environmental criteria which has spatially identified the location of these environmental features for the C zones mapping analysis. The estuarine planning level, or EPL, studies define the estuarine inundation risk, also referred to as coastal inundation, during extreme but rare storm events for affected properties under both existing and future sea level conditions. The EPL studies have been prepared for North Harbour and Middle Harbour in Sydney Harbour and Cowan Creek at Cottage Point. The studies use the same approach and methodology as the previous Pittwater EPL study, mapping all properties affected by estuarine inundation. Council has responsibility to manage coastal hazard risks under the Coastal Management Act and the Coastal Management State Environmental Planning Policy. This includes strategic planning as well as applying planning provisions and development controls to reduce risks to the natural and built environments for current and future coastal hazards. These studies have informed the spatial mapping analysis for the C zones by identifying properties that are at risk from current coastal inundation. The Geotechnical Review Report is a technical study undertaken by engineering consulting firm Douglas Partners. It sought to review the existing planning controls across the 3 former local government areas associated with geotechnical related matters and provide updated mapping and controls to be incorporated in a unified local environmental plan and development control plan for the Northern Beaches. A detailed table and map is contained that tags all land into one of 7 geotechnical planning classes, depending on the known underlying geology or soil and topographic position at slope. The 3 highest risk geotechnical classes have informed the spatial mapping analysis of the draft C zones by identifying properties that are at risk from the highest geotechnical classes. I will now hand back over to Andrew.
Great, thank you very much, Kim. Okay, so just for a quick recap on where we're up to. So the New South Wales Government requires all councils to review and develop a single planning framework for their local government area. Our proposal, based on comprehensive studies, will help create a sustainable future for the Northern Beaches. We've identified and proposed conservation zones to best fit the attributes of the land. The proposed changes may affect what you can and can't do on your property, but we're still at an early stage and genuinely want to hear your feedback. So we encourage you to contact us and make a submission. Let us know what you like, let us know what you don't like, and we will go through all of that material and consider that as we analyse all of these submissions. In terms of the next steps, so as we've outlined, we are on exhibition at the moment. We will try and engage as much as possible during the exhibition period, which does formally close on the 30th of October. If you do need to get your submission in slightly later than that, we can be a little bit accommodating if you just reach out to us and let us know if you're having troubles meeting that date, and we can see if we can work with you to get your submission in. We'll review all of the material that comes in during the exhibition period at the end of this year, and then we will put an outcomes report together, which we'll put out early or next year when we do prepare our draft local environmental plan and development control plan, which we intend to report to council around the middle of 2023. And again, there will be a further round of exhibition for that document. My colleague Neil Cox, I believe, is going to respond to a number of the questions that we have received in the lead up to tonight's webinar, and I can see also that there are some questions coming into the Q&A format, which have been responded to. If we can't get to all of those questions, then we'll endeavour to get back to you in the days following tonight's briefing. So you can see some questions that are on the screen there, and I believe that Neil is going to provide some responses to those questions.
Good day, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks, Neil.
Can you see me?
We can't see you, but
okay.
Maybe just go with the answers, and we'll see if we can.
Okay, look, that's fine. Yeah, so these are some of the questions we received prior to the webinar, which we wanted to try and get to tonight. And as Andrew suggests, we'll try and finish some of the others off that we're getting in the chat, either tonight if we have time, or later on, maybe after this webinar. So, what is a residential zone and what will be permitted? It's came up in the questions earlier on, I think, as well, that we've shown a generic residential zone in many of the areas in Pittwater where land would be rezoned from a C4 zone to a residential zone. We haven't finalised the work on that residential zone, but without doubt it will be a low density residential zone known as an R2 zone more generally. So that's the intention. It's clearly intended that we've got a low density residential zone, an R2 residential zone. We have to sort out the final mix of land uses in that zone, but it will be consistent. Of course, we have a range of other R2 zones across the council area, so we need to have a look at that. And look, and if you have particular suggestions around what should be permitted in the R2 zone, we would be happy to take those as well. But the reason why we haven't given a final designation of that is that we've still to determine that work, and that work will be done in conjunction with the new local environmental plan, which will be done over the next few months. Question about, will a residential zone mean more density than a C4 zone? No, it's not intended that the residential zone be anything other than a low density residential zone, as I said earlier, an R2 zone. So that's the intention. There may be some state government policy which could interact with an R2 zone slightly differently to a C4 zone. So it's a little bit unpredictable because the way the state government operates with its state environmental planning policies and where they apply. But it's certainly Council's intention that it remain a low density residential zone. How's the new C4 zone different to the current C4 zone? Well, in the Pittwater Council area, there'll be very little difference. In other former council areas under the Pittwater LEP, it will be very, very similar to the current C4. What that means is secondary dwellings would still be permissible. There'd be virtually the exact same range of permissible uses would be available under the new C4 for the Northern Beaches. So we're actually using the Pittwater, if you like, LEP C4 as the basis for a C4 zone across the remainder of the council area. Why are we prohibiting secondary dwellings in the C3 zone? I think Susie has responded to that in the Q&A pretty well, so I won't go into it anymore now. Will we still be able to do an Airbnb? This came up on a couple of occasions from different people. I think the question is around what is the definition of bed and breakfast accommodation, and that will be prohibited because we don't, in the C3 environmental zone, because we don't believe that tourist and visitor accommodation should be exposed to high hazard areas or in areas with high environmental values. However, Airbnb is a separate definition. It's actually defined as short-term rental accommodation, and that's controlled under a state environmental planning policy for housing, and it overrides council's policies to permit Airbnb type accommodation in accordance with its requirements, so the zone won't impact that. Next to the question, why are properties that have been cleared not identified for a conservation zone? I think very simply, the New South Wales government guidelines stipulate that we can't really zone land for environmental purposes unless it has some sort of environmental value or has some hazards criteria apply in that area. Illegal clearing has been an issue in the council area. All I can say is that council will prosecute illegal clearing where it has evidence of that occurring, and that's all that we can do on that front. How will this affect current development applications? Where there's an existing development consent for a use and a zoning comes into effect which may prohibit that use, those development consents are still valid and can be used or implemented in accordance with their terms. Usually development consents are valid for 5 years, so that's the period in which you would generally have to commence work on any development associated with a consent. Existing buildings and land uses on sites would not be affected. So if a prohibition comes into effect, then you have a use which has been legally established on your property, but is now prohibited. That use can continue and would be protected. And in fact, if it were a flat building, for example, in a C3 zone, it could be rebuilt. There would be a merit assessment of what that building would look like, but nothing prevents you from submitting a development application for the rebuilding or extending or alterations to a so-called existing use. I would also say that on that front, this work that we're doing here will take some time to finalise, so the Department of Planning will have to approve that, and that would take really up until the end of next year before you would see any change to a new local environmental plan. So there would still be opportunity to submit a new development application under the current set of rules and have it approved prior to the commencement of any new zoning controls. Has the Department of Planning approved the methodology used? At this point, we've had a lot of consultation with the department prior to commencing this work, and we've also used their guidelines and circulars to assist us in developing the methodology. However, the reason we're out there exhibiting the methodology is that we want everybody to comment upon that. The Department of Planning has not from we approved the methodology. We'll be continuing to talk and consulting with the department as we speak, and also following the submissions process, we will need to consider all submissions, and we will be talking to the Department of Planning again following those submissions to determine whether or not the methodology as drafted and as exhibited is the appropriate methodology to move forward with. And ultimately, the Department of Planning will have the final say on the methodology, as it is the department which would approve any changes to zoning required in the local environmental plans as a result of that work. Will landowners be compensated for loss of permissible land uses from rezoning? So if a rezoning did occur and some land uses that are currently permissible are no longer permissible, that's quite common. It's also common to go in reverse, where you maybe have a zone now which permits certain uses, and there's a rezoning and there'd be additional permitted uses in the zone. There's no normal requirement in planning legislation for compensation to be paid, or council or the Department of Planning to acquire land where there's been a change of zoning which reduces the range of permissible uses in that zone or on that site. Normally, unless there's some sort of public use proposed for that land, it could be a C2 zone, or a zone that would be for a recreational zone, so for a park or a road or some other piece of infrastructure. Only in those cases would there be compensation or acquisition contemplated. As I said earlier, whilst there's no normal requirement for compensation in these circumstances, neither is it the case that where there is a financial gain or as a result of a change of permissible uses, neither does council or the state government tax that any sort of windfall gain as well. So it works both ways. That's probably the end of the list of questions we had from the webinar, pre-webinar talks. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks very much, Neil. Look, I'm just seeing that there are a lot of questions that are coming in and being responded to in the Q&A live chat. So we're doing our best to get back to you on those in that live context. Look, the reality is it won't be possible to get to every single question that comes in, particularly some of the more technical questions. We might need to take some time just to do a bit of research and respond to some of those as they're coming through. And we'll endeavour to get back to you in the days following the Q&A. But it's been good to see some of the questions coming in and some of the responses that have been provided. Interesting ones in relation to, I guess, the interplay of that permissibility between when you're moving from an R2 to a C4 zone or even to a C3 zone, and how that permissibility changes what you can and can't do. Importantly, the dwelling houses, just to be clear, are still permitted in that C3 zone. It's I guess the intensification of development that we don't necessarily want to see in that C3 area for areas that we know are subject to hazards, particularly, so not wanting to introduce and increase risks to property and life in those areas. In relation to the C4 zone, obviously we're saying that look, those areas do have some particular environmental qualities that we're saying we would like to preserve and protect. You can again still develop those properties, but there's just extra things that we want people to consider during that, I guess, development process to make sure that the environmental values of those areas are protected while balancing the rights of people to be able to develop their property and have a house and a swimming pool and enjoy the benefit of their own property, obviously. So look, with all of that in mind, I think we've covered a lot of ground tonight. There's obviously a lot of material that's available on the website and on exhibition. Really thank you for taking the time to attend the event tonight and to keep yourself across the information. We are available to continue the conversation tomorrow and in the coming days via email if you'd like, or on the phone if you want to talk to someone specifically. Again, would encourage you to go to the website, and if you haven't already, and have a look at all of the information available there, including that property tool that allows you to search for your specific property and see what zone you are now and what your proposed to be, and what the permissibilities are, and why that change is proposed. I think we might wrap it up for now and say thank you again for coming along tonight, and we look forward to hearing from you as we continue our exhibition period. Thank you very much, everybody.